Welcome. Vice President Biden has presented his plan to combat gun violence. Details are emerging. It includes a ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines and expanded background checks. It's taken back-to-back massacres to make these reforms politically plausible. The loss of 20 children in Connecticut, of course, 12 moviegoers in Aurora, Colorado, 6 worshipers at a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, and more. But most gun deaths in America come one person at a time, and not in the suburbs. Somehow, this everyday background level of gun violence, about 10,000 murders a year, is accepted. We will look at that today. We will also examine New York's health system. Is it ready for another megastorm, or the flu, which is now an official public health emergency in New York State? And we'll hear about a surprising protest in China against censorship, a victory or punishment postponed. All this, plus a drenched downtown digital archive, drives itself out from Sandy and reminds us all to back up our work. First, though, guns. While New York City's murder rate is at a 40-year low, a remarkable achievement to be sure, the pop of gunfire is still a regular sound in neighborhoods like Central Harlem, Brownsville, or East New York. There were nearly 1,500 shootings in New York City last year, 414 dead. Philadelphia, 324 dead. In Chicago's schools alone, 319 students were shot, 24 of them fatally. Why not more attention to the cities and these victims? And would any kind of gun control do much to save those lives? Joining us now, Robin Holmes-Myers, project director of a model violence intervention program called Operation S.N.U.G, that's guns spelled backwards. She's also a member of the City Council's task force to combat gun violence. And with us as well, David Cole, professor of constitutional law and criminal justice at the Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C. He writes on legal affairs for The Nation and the New York Review of Books. Welcome to both of you. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks.
Robin, tell our viewers about a typical day for S.N.U.G, let's say in Central Harlem.
So, Brian, a typical day for S.N.U.G in Harlem, and let me just explain a little bit about the catchment area in which we cover. We cover 72 blocks of Central Harlem from 145th to 127th, from St. Nicholas to Lenox Avenue. However, we have this great partnership with Harlem Hospital, and we're part of their Circle of Safety protocol. And so what that means is that when a shooting or a stabbing or vicious beating is brought into Harlem Hospital, we are given a call. And so I have 3 violence interrupters, hospital responders, and I just recently was able to hire 2 hospital responders. And so we get the call, we go in, we begin to intervene to find out what was going on, what happened. If there's a shooting, we make sure that we're having conversation with that victim so there is no retaliation that's about to happen. So that call comes in every single day. And how do I know that? It's because I get the text, the blast goes out to the team saying, I'm at Harlem Hospital, there's a 21-year-old victim, shot, stabbed, sliced, whatever the situation is, and that we are on the case. And so, because of the fact that we've had this partnership with Harlem Hospital, we've sort of expanded our sort of catchment area to some degree, even though the catchment area is what we are responsible for, but because of the relationship with Harlem Hospital, we respond to all of the shootings and stabbings. 1,500
shootings a year in the city, that's about 4 a day. What percentage of those do you think are carried out with assault weapons, which is what the nation is consumed with debating right now?
Well, I would say the majority of them are carried out with an assault weapon.
Really?
Yeah, with an assault weapon. I mean, you can beg to differ to some degree because when a shooting does occur, where you don't normally know where the gun or what kind of gun was used at the time of the shooting, and so again, folks are not aware of the fact that these young people that are in the inner cities are getting their hands on some really powerful weapons.
But when you say, just to be clear what we're talking about, when you say an assault weapon,
you're talking about
what people are conjuring these days is, one of those Bushmaster AR-15 rifles.
Oh, no, okay, let me correct, no.
Not a Glock or some other kind of handgun.
Gotcha.
But you're talking about handguns.
I'm talking about handguns.
That are assault weapons.
Yes.
And so, David, my question for you is that even on the table in Washington? You wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that suggested it isn't.
Yeah, no, well, I think what seems to be on the table are the kinds of weapons that are used in places like Newtown and Aurora that have caused these national tragedies. What doesn't seem to be on the table are measures that would deal with what is the vast majority of gun violence in this country, which is gun violence in the inner city, conducted not with assault weapons, but with handguns, where the victims are, for the most part, poor, young, minority. And I think in large part because the victims are young, poor, and minority, the American people have sort of looked the other way, and that hasn't been a concern with respect to the right to bear arms. It's only when you get an event like Newtown in a suburb, vast majority of the victims, young, white children, that you see national headlines and some impetus for reform. And
we've been here before. In the 1990s, when there was plenty of one-at-a-time gun violence in the urban areas, more than there is today, the nation didn't take it seriously as a problem until Columbine, which was a mostly white, suburban to ex-urban kind of school.
Well, again, I think people are self-interested, and people don't, they think, well, I might be the victim, or I can imagine being the victim of some kind of assault weapon crazy incident, because they could occur literally anywhere at any time. But as long as the gun violence is safely cabined in the inner city, then the vast majority of the American people, and certainly a lot of the gun rights people who live in rural states in the South and the West, they can ignore it, and they don't have to pay the cost of the right to bear arms. It's those kids in the inner city that are paying that cost.
So, Robin, to help people in Central Harlem and Brownsville and East New York avoid violence, are they talking about the right kinds of measures, in your opinion, with respect to guns in Washington? An assault weapons ban, a high-capacity magazine ban, closing the background check loopholes, and these are the same kinds of things that are coming out of Albany in the new state bill, too. Are they the right things?
I think that those are just small pieces of this. I mean, it's a larger issue that we are dealing with. There are layers of, I think that when this shooting happened at Sandy Hook, they talked about the mental health of this young man. And so our young people, our inner cities have always been mental health, might be a mental health issue. And so, my concern is that there are different layers to this. So yes, okay, the laws and legislations around that, okay, that's great. But again, what else are we doing? Unemployment rates are high in these areas. There are the after-school programs are closing down, so no recreation is happening. We don't have vocational training programs for our young people. So there's a lot of layers that are put into this. And one particular thing is that the mental health. A lot of our young people are traumatized. People don't have a clue that, a young person who is, inner city, have seen shootings, have been around shootings, have experienced someone being shot. We did a focus group one time with about 10 or 15 young people, and the question was, have you seen, do you know somebody who's been shot? All hands went in the air, and so again, there's trauma around that,
a percentage of PTSD among those populations. David, you're a civil libertarian. Does that include the Second Amendment? Can you get your passion flowing for those constitutional rights as opposed to, or in addition to, the First Amendment or the Fifth Amendment?
Well, I think the Second Amendment came out of a particular period in our history, right? After the Revolution, we have the First Amendment is about speech, Second Amendment is about the right to bear arms, Third Amendment is about keeping troops out of your home. This was a country that had experienced the need to revolt, et cetera. I think we've moved beyond that. But I don't think the Second Amendment is really the problem here, in the sense that, yes, the court has recognized that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to bear arms. But at the same time, they recognized that it is subject to reasonable regulation. And they just said reasonable regulation includes background checks, licensing requirements, includes bans on assault weapons. There weren't any assault weapons at the time the Constitution was drafted, so that wasn't what they were protecting. So it would include bans on carrying guns, public carrying guns in schools, et cetera. So it's not the Constitution that is in the way. I think it's the politics really that's in the way. And I don't think what they're proposing is really adequate. It's important. We need an effective national background check licensing requirements, but we also need targeted measures at where the problem is at its worst. And I haven't seen any suggestion from
What would
the
that
Biden
mean,
committee.
targeted measures?
Well,
Like what?
one that has been very effective is the kind of program that's run in Harlem, this Operation S.N.U.G. It's modeled on Operation Ceasefire, which was first done in Boston and has been replicated throughout the country, and it's targeting those places where gun violence is worse, going in, identifying who the bad actors are, because it's usually a very small number who are creating most of the problems, building cases on them, threatening them with prosecution, not necessarily prosecuting, threatening with prosecution, but also offering assistance and help and social work services and the like, and saying, look, if the violence stops, we won't go after you. If the violence continues, we will go after you. And that has been shown to be effective in city after city as a measure. But I also think we need things like better aftercare programs so that kids are supervised between the time they get out of school when their parents come, better reintegration programs for many people. So there's a whole host of things that we need to deal with, the communities where the problem is worst, if we're going to be honest about the cost of the right to bear arms.
And I just want to just, as a clarity and somewhat of a correction, is that the program, the actual initiative that we're running is Operation S.N.U.G. It is a ceasefire, now cure violence model, which is the one that comes out of Chicago, not the one that comes out of Boston.
Okay.
And so what the criteria of that particular program is to work with the highest risk individual using a credible messenger approach. And so what that means is that these credible messengers have similar backgrounds, and they're working with these high-risk individuals to get them to change the mindset. It's really changing the mindset. I mean, I know that, you know, David Kennedy,
Yeah.
he has an approach, and I think that there are multiple layers of approach, and that's what I meant by that, Ryan, that there are multiple ways to handle and to address this issue. So Operation S.N.U.G. is not just the end-all, be-all, but I think that it is a way, it is a program and an initiative, because we have 5 of them within the city that can work.
So on that point, and before we run out of time, I want to get you both on the mental health piece of this.
Okay.
It seems to me that if there's one point of confluence between the NRA and the Democrats, it's that it should be harder for people with mental health histories to get a gun license. And I wonder if you have an opinion on that. With all the mental health trauma that you were just describing, do you discriminate against too many people, if that's the direction that we're going in, who've had some kind of mental health treatment, or is that exactly what's needed? Do you have any position on that?
I mean, I'm not going to take a position on that, Ryan. I think that it should be a process and a level of process that is put in place for anyone to obtain a gun, you know, and if that means mental health, if that means someone who was recently incarcerated, if that means so, but again, I think that there are many layers to this, and that we need to address the issue at hand, which is to work with, because our whole thing is that we can change the mindset of a young person to put the gun down, right? And so we cannot tell him not to take the gun. We can say to him, these are measures and these are things that will happen to you. And so if I can change the mindset, eventually you're going to put the gun down.
And those are mostly illegal weapons that we're talking about in those cases, right? And as for the legal guns, is this a progressive's dilemma? Because on the one hand, you want people with mental health problems not to be stigmatized and to have maximum rights in our society. On the other hand, you want to crack down on the number of people who are getting legal guns, passing the background checks.
Well, I think one of the very reasonable regulations of guns is that you have to show that you're qualified to have a gun. Right. And if you have mental health problems, I don't think you're qualified.
Right.
If you have a serious conviction for crime, I don't think you're qualified. I think you should. The presumption
but where's the line?
The presumption should not.
On antidepressants for 6 months, you're going to.
No, that's not going to be the line. I'm not exactly. I'm not precisely sure where the line will be, but yeah. I think the presumption should not be everyone should have a gun, unless proven. Right. Not. I think the presumption should be no. People shouldn't have guns unless they can demonstrate that they actually know how to use it, that they're responsible, that they have a need, etc. And that's how the UK does it. They don't ban guns, but they have very strict licensing requirements, and they have something like 52 gun deaths a year. We have 10,000.
It's a segment that we should do separately and have a full discussion on burden of proof, because you're right. There are countries where the burden of proof is on you to demonstrate that you are qualified to own a gun, rather than here, where you would have to somehow be disqualified.
Right.
And unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Obviously, a big topic that we'll keep talking about. David and Robin, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Up next, New York's emergency healthcare system after Sandy, how to make it ready for the next disaster. Is New York's health system ready for the next Hurricane Sandy or the flu epidemic should it get worse? Long before Sandy or the current flu emergency, our next guest wrote a cautionary volume entitled Americans at Risk: Why We Are Not Prepared for Mega Disasters and What We Can Do Now. He is Dr. Irwin Redlener, and he directs the National Center on Disaster Preparedness at the Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. Dr. Redlener also co-chairs Governor Cuomo's newly formed New York State Readiness Commission, or Ready Commission, a response to Sandy. Welcome back to our show.
Thanks, Brian.
Let me start with the flu. Governor Cuomo did declare an official state health emergency. I don't remember that in previous flu seasons. What does it actually mean?
Well, it really acknowledges the fact that we have a rampaging flu situation now, which is, it obviously could be worse, but we definitely have a significant number of cases in New York and elsewhere. And the implications of the governor's declaration is that pharmacies and pharmacists can now actually vaccinate young children, including those as young as 6 months of age. And that's it gives formal cover to allow certain protocols to go into place, which are important right now.
Makes it easier. In fact, I myself, earlier in the season, tried to take my teenager to a local pharmacy for a flu shot, and they said, nope, can't do it for that age. So we had to make an appointment and wait until the date came around at his pediatrician. Exactly.
Taking a teenager in general is difficult, but yeah, but getting the vaccines for some people is really getting difficult, and now we're experiencing a little bit of a shortage of the vaccine in some places, and something we're going to have to pay attention to. But it really is important that people get vaccinated. Extraordinary number of people have not gotten vaccinated. I'm surprised to find out.
And what about the hospitals? Emergency rooms are certainly being flooded. Do we have the capacity for that? And inpatient admissions for severe cases of the flu?
Right. So in 2009, when we had the so-called H1N1 epidemic of flu, we had
swine flu, quote unquote.
Exactly. We had very substantial problems with the emergency rooms being extraordinarily overcrowded, with people just rushing to the emergency rooms. And we talked about a lot of solutions to making sure that that would not happen in the future. Not much of that actually occurred, and we're sort of hoping that we don't get a severe situation right now, because the fact is I don't think many of our health systems are ready to accommodate big rushes of people to the emergency rooms. And we're not really making enough use, actually, of the clinics and hospital doctors' offices, rather, that are affiliated with hospitals. And I think we have to get a little bit better in that arena.
All right. The New York State Ready Commission, the governor still figuring out exactly how New York should prepare for the next potential hurricane. We had Irene and Sandy in back-to-back years, so presumably things like this are going to happen again in the not-too-distant future. What's your number one proposal in terms of how to be ready in ways that we were not?
Well, it's hard to choose a number one. Unfortunately, we have a whole array of issues that have to be, that really have to be dealt with. And I'm going to put aside for a moment the fact that because of climate change, we're going to have the likelihood of much more frequent, much more severe storms than we've had in the past. And that's something we just need to know. And there's a whole set of agenda items on that, but we're not going to talk about that now. But I think the other issue, of course, is our infrastructure is in terrible state nationally and here in New York, and a lot of work has to be done there. But as far as what we were charged to do by the governor with this new commission was to look at some of the highest priority items in terms of getting ready for the next disasters. One of the things we were deeply concerned about were the vulnerable populations, the people, the communities where there were special needs that went beyond the general let's get ready for a big disaster agenda that we typically will plan for. Turns out that almost half the population has some sort of special need. We have thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who fall into the categories of frail elderly who were living alone, let's say in high-rise apartment buildings that eventually lost electricity. We have children, we have people that are dependent on medical devices, people absolutely dependent on daily doses of critical life-saving medications. We have people with disabilities. There's a whole array of things that make individuals particularly vulnerable. That's one of the main areas of focus.
So is this about cataloging who those people are? This is a data challenge and a mapping challenge?
There are many aspects to these challenges that are entailed by making the provisions to take care of people with vulnerabilities. So, for instance, the issue of frail elderly who live by themselves and are really in big trouble when the electricity goes out and elevators aren't working and there's no heat, they are extremely vulnerable. And people have suggested, we will be suggesting a registry so that we can understand and know where people are and in advance understand how we're going to get to them in an emergency. That, of course, runs right up against these issues of privacy and other concerns that we'll have to figure out, but it's probably going to start off as a voluntary registry.
And even if you have that, how do you constantly update it? Because people move, people die.
And people's conditions get worse, they get better, There's all sorts of things that happen. So it's not just writing a list that you keep in a drawer someplace. It's how do we do this in a way that is updated so it's actually useful when the time comes. It's a big challenge, but we have to kind of get a hold of this.
You also propose stockpiling fuel because another big ramification of Sandy was gasoline lines.
Yes, and this is actually one of those things which is quite preventable. It's like the fragility with the electrical system and other of the major systems. There are definitely things that we can do to stockpile fuel, to make sure that gas stations located in strategic communities have a backup generator so they can actually pump gas once they get the delivery. But there's a number of things that can happen there, and also strengthening and making much more resilient our hospitals, our electrical system, and all the other things that we're dependent on.
Was it a fuel shortage too in the case of some of the hospital shutdowns? Did they run out of generator fuel? Do I remember this correctly?
Yeah, well, the big problem was, we had several large hospitals that were planning on sheltering in place, not actually evacuating their patients, in other words, continuing functions. In order to do that, you have to have a robust, very resilient backup electrical generator system. What we found out from Katrina in New Orleans is if you keep the generators on the ground floor in the basement, the floods come and then you get wiped out. So we, of course, have been requiring hospitals to put their generators on high floors or on the roof, which we did. All that was fine, except that the fuel pumps and the fuel storage, the electrical relays that let the pumps work, were still located on the lower floors. They got flooded out. And for NYU Langone Medical Center, for Bellevue, for other hospitals and nursing homes, the backup generators failed. I'm hoping that will never, ever happen again. And part of our recommendations deal with that.
Give me one other of your recommendations before we run out of time. Pick one.
Well,
I see the whole list of them, but what are you enthusiastic to talk about?
Well, one of the other big recommendations has to do with the area of communications, making sure that we have communications and coordination among the response agencies. We're getting better at it, but we still have a ways to go. So we're looking at radio communications and the ability to coordinate among agencies as another big idea that we have to deal with.
I want to circle back around to our previous segment and guns before you go and ask you where your community, the public health community, comes in. I heard an astounding stat from an emergency room physician on NPR this morning, and it was that for every one household where a gun is used in self-defense, let's say to stop an intruder, there are 43 households
Right.
where the gun is used against someone else in the household.
Right.
That seems to me such an incredibly powerful stat that supports gun control arguments, frankly, that the public health community should be out there being a scientific community and saying, hey, people, forget about politics for a minute, look at the numbers.
Right. Well, you know, there are many issues around the gun question which are of deep concern to not only public health officials, but people in the healthcare business. You can't speak to an emergency room physician in any hospital in the country without getting stories about the number of people that are seen as victims of gun violence, almost all of which involve people that know other people, and that's who the victims are. And I don't know what we're going to do about this. We have 280 million plus guns in the United States of America, almost one per citizen. Eradicating those guns and making them disappear, the ones that are not being used for legitimate hunting and legitimate self-defense, if there is such a category, is going to be extremely difficult. And I don't know exactly what's going to come out of all these discussions and the recommendations from the Vice President, but we do have to take this under absolute advisement right now, because we are facing a crisis that turns out to be a public health crisis. Too many guns, too many people killed and injured by guns in America, and we have to figure a way out of this.
And the reporting that segment was based on with that ER physician and that stat was that the NRA has apparently been successful in crimping the ability of doctors to collect data on shootings and compile them in any way where people can actually look at the numbers, because they are afraid, or they want us to believe that they're afraid that seeing these stats will lead to gun confiscation.
Yeah, the National Rifle Association, the NRA, is probably the most powerful, effective lobbying organization in the country's history. You know, you might argue maybe the realtors are, but really the NRA has been in a class by itself. And I'm hoping that, and listen, nobody knows all the answers to this. It's a very difficult problem. There is a Second Amendment, but we have to get a way out of this. The problem with the NRA is they are so extreme, they're so paranoid about losing any ground whatsoever. They keep calling it a slippery slope, and I think that's really a misnomer here. But they've actually shut down the data production around the dangers of guns and what we need to do by using their lobbying pressure to cut off funding for appropriate research on gun violence in America. And that's really an incredibly unfortunate situation that's going to have to be faced. And hopefully our members of Congress and people in our national governments and our state governments will now start standing up to the gun lobby and saying, no more, we've had enough of this. And really, they're not even necessarily representing gun owners as much as they are representing gun manufacturers. And the continuing flow of money to those industries is a big problem.
Dr. Irwin Redlener, great to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.
Chinese journalists, our next topic. Did they win a big free speech victory last week? Something very unusual for China did happen. Or is a crackdown coming as the long-term result? After this break. It all began after a Chinese newspaper, the reform-minded Southern Weekly, wrote a front-page New Year's Day message mentioning the dream of a constitutional government. The senior editors had signed off on it. They went to bed, but the paper did not. When it appeared, the editorial had been transformed, magic, into a tribute to the Communist Party. George Orwell, hello. In a rare act of defiance, reporters, editors, and supporters, including academics and business leaders in China, used Weibo, that's Chinese Twitter, to condemn government censorship. There were demonstrations at the paper, a strike threat, and words of support, some cleverly veiled, which we'll talk about, from other papers around China. Very rare. What happened next isn't clear. Compromise, crackdown, or both. Hard to know at a distance. But Madeline Earp keeps a very close eye on Chinese journalists. She is senior researcher for the Asia program at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
Is the very fact that the Southern Weekly still exists, was not shut down by the government, a sign of change?
In some ways, you could say it is a sign of change. Certainly in the past, they wouldn't have been able to continue, and they wouldn't have been able to find a compromise like this with the local authorities. However, I would say that it is also in the authorities' interest not to close them down, because by allowing them to continue, they have essentially stepped back from any conflict, and they maintain this impression that they are listening, that they are engaged, that they're not cracking down. Whether that's really the case, we have to wait and see.
They must have known at Southern Weekly that they were either stepping right up to the line or crossing the line on New Year's Day. I was in China recently on a tour for journalists, met many journalists and academics and all kinds of people, and what I heard from person after person, regardless of their politics, was there's a new level of free speech in China compared to 10 years ago. And what it is elites and even regular folks on Weibo, Chinese Twitter, can criticize government policies, but you can't call for a change in the nature of the government. And that's exactly what they did in this case.
They did, but you also have to remember that their demands are essentially on a spectrum. So with Chinese journalists, you can have some who are very pro-state, they're essentially mouthpieces for the party. Then, on the extreme level are the people who really can't get a job in the mainstream media because they're too outspoken, they're too critical. So these journalists are trying to maintain a delicate balance somewhere in the middle. And that means that they are critical, they do use their voice, but what they call for is political reform. They don't call for revolution, they don't call for anyone to be overthrown. And I think their demands in the open letters that they wrote after the New Year editorial were very much in that vein. They were encouraging the leaders themselves to change, not looking for the leadership to be overturned.
So some of the support this newspaper got from other journalists who may not be as explicit or feel free to be as explicit as Southern Weekly was in its original editorial, have used what I was referring to before as cleverly veiled support techniques. Tell us the story of how congee, the Chinese soupy rice dish, was used to represent support.
Well, that's a great one. So it's a very long tradition coming from internet culture, which is to use puns, homonyms, other references to foodstuffs or anything that resembles what you're trying to discuss in any way. So, for example, a lot of people were saying, have a great rest this weekend, for example, and that is, an indication that the staff at the Southern Weekend, or Southern Weekly as it's often translated, should take care of themselves. And there are many similar ones, as you mentioned, the soupy Chinese rice dish. Did you read what that was referring to?
Well, I gather that it's popular in the South in particular, so it was a reference to Southern Weekly being a Southern newspaper with a Southern food.
Right.
Was
so
that it?
That's a classic one, and a great.
But who gets that? How inside do you have to be to get that? How many of the billion people in China, should they read the particular news, would even get it?
Right, so that's why I'm sort of interested to see, how easy it is for outsiders to pick up on this language, because for a reader in China, it might not click immediately, but if you're an internet user and you're engaged and you're familiar with that kind of use of language, you would recognize it straight away. And what's more, once you'd used it once or twice, you'd probably take the next step and evolve it, to refer to something else, or you'd take maybe a snapshot of yourself, holding, a bowl of congee, for example. That's much harder to censor if you're, you're looking for keywords, which is one way that the internet censors on Weibo will try and track discussion. So they know the censors are following, and they also know that they can stay one step ahead by using these kinds of really playful, fun techniques.
But is this just a discussion that Chinese elites from the business and academic and journalistic communities are having among themselves? Or do the really 1.3 billion people in China start to hear it? And are their attitudes toward free speech, including journalistic free speech, changing? Is this becoming relevant to their lives?
It's absolutely relevant, and it's becoming more relevant as the internet grows in China. There's a massive number of people online, and they may not start out seeking banned content. But it's only a matter of time if you're on sites like Weibo that until you sort of trip over one of these veiled references, one of these sort of slightly underground cultural memes which are going around. And it's very easy to find instructions on how to circumvent censorship online. They're fairly freely available. So as that trend continues, it'll become more and more relevant to people outside of the elite.
Now, this is the way the story has gotten out so far. Pushing the envelope, people are smiling, okay, they crack down on the Southern Weekly, but it's another crack in the system and, you know, dissent is sneaking through. But people have been arrested for demonstrating in support of this newspaper, right?
That's correct, yes. There's this sort of awkward pause right now as the immediate conflict seems to have come to an end, and everyone is sort of waiting with bated breath to see exactly what will happen. Now, it's very common for this to happen when there are outbreaks of public unrest in China. There will be some kind of compromise with the local authorities which diffuses the demonstration. But then those who organize the demonstrations, in other words, those who, besides criticizing, are also taking action to try and persuade other people to join together and act against the government. Those are the people who they tend to look for. So we don't know yet whether these will be, significant cases, whether people will be indicted or not. What the other thing we'd look for is journalists are less likely to be imprisoned themselves, are less likely to be indicted on criminal charges than they used to be, but they're very likely to be either fined or reshuffled or sent on some kind of enforced leave. That may not happen for several months, but it would be very likely in connection with what's just happened.
That seems to be the pattern. When the international media spotlight goes away, then the crackdown starts, and people domestically realize this is still unsafe. I read a stat that there are 32 journalists in prison in China right now. Do you know that to be true?
That is true. That's the number that the Committee to Protect Journalists documented on its census, which is put out on December 1st each year. So that dates from December 1st, 2012. Those are not the same community of people as those at Southern Weekend. They are much more likely to be freelancers working online. They're likely to have published overseas, or they're likely to be ethnic minorities like Tibetan or Uyghur journalists who are writing about life under Chinese rule. That's much too sensitive for the Communist Party, and so those people are under much more severe pressure. Now, we hope that that is not going to repeat itself with the Southern Weekend journalists who organized this protest and wrote these letters, but it was less than 10 years ago that some journalists at their sister paper, Southern Metropolis Daily, were jailed after reporting some fairly critical anti-government stories. So it's not that long ago that some very severe jail sentences might be expected to come from an activity like this.
Interesting times in China with the new government just having taken over in the 10-year transition. Will they loosen up? Will they crack down to show they're serious and then loosen up? We don't know. The moment being used by Southern Weekly or Southern Weekend and some others to test the waters, and certainly worth following. And thank you for your work protecting journalists who might be in legal or physical danger around the world at CPJ.
Thank you, Brian.
Up next, a local digital archive saved after Sandy. Wait till you see these excerpts. Last fall, Hurricane Sandy roared into Manhattan's Chelsea neighborhood and flooded the I-Beam Art and Technology Center. It lost $250,000 worth of audio and video equipment and computers, a heavy blow to the nonprofit, but these were items that could be replaced. Also submerged in 3 feet of brackish Hudson River water was I-Beam's multimedia archive, spanning 15 years of New York's experimental digital art. That sent a bolt of fear through the organization, but they hope that much of the archive will be restored. We will see some amazing footage that was saved. Ironically, as Sandy hit, I-Beam resident Jonathan Menard was working on a documentary preaching the importance of digital archiving. So he joins us now, along with I-Beam Executive Director Patricia Jones. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Why don't you start and tell us what the project was that involved your archiving and what kind of stuff we're going to see.
I was working on a documentary called Archive, really exploring digital memory, how we invest our cultural products, also personal lives, in bytes, and the long-term future of that information, really what it takes to ensure that our cultural memories, our legacies survive.
And what is I-beam exactly, for people who don't know this particular art space?
Okay, I-beam, as you mentioned, has been around for 15 years, and at its core, it supports artists such as Jonathan to really investigate and push the envelope at the intersection of art, technology, and science, and gives them an opportunity to take risks and experiment and also collaborate and work with their most creative peers. And then beyond that, we take that work and bring it to a broad public to help them understand what these new technologies are, where the future is going in this area, and how it can impact their own lives.
So I think we have some silent video of people cleaning the media after Sandy. What are we looking at here, Jonathan?
So I-beam had a large media collection of about 2,000 items which were stored on the first floor of our space in Chelsea, which is on West 21st Street, right across the street from the Hudson River. And this archive included all formats you can imagine: DVDs, CDs, formats quickly going obsolete, such as beta tapes, VHS, mini DV tapes. And when the building was inundated, although our staff had made preparations to put them off the floor about 1.5 to 2 feet, we didn't anticipate.
Wait a minute, that's a VHS.
That is
that's
a VHS
too old-fashioned for I-beam, isn't it?
Well, our work goes back about 15 years, and this is the only record of some of that innovative work that had been done. So when we returned to the space the day after Sandy and found the building with 3 feet of water, one of the first things we knew we had to attend to was this important collection. And so, being a very kind of radically open organization, without a second thought, our staff began tweeting, posting images of the damage, and we were really blessed to have this outpouring of support from our community. Among the respondents were Audiovisual Preservation Solutions. They are a consulting firm led by Chris Lasnak and Caravan Milson, who are professional moving image conservators. They came to the rescue. They were there within 48 hours. We were emptying the bins, drying out the media, and they put a system in place so that when volunteers came to help, we had delegated roles. We were immersing the media in distilled water, cleaning it off with alcohol, and stabilizing that media so that no further damage occurred. Some
of what we were seeing there. Let's see, just for the fun of it, a couple of examples of things that got saved. Which of you wants to set up for us this 2002 piece, Messa di Voce?
I'll let Jonathan do that because he was the one who put it all together.
Sure. So Messa di Voce is a performance system by Golan Levin and Zach Lieberman, who are two artists who work with software. And they designed a really performance tool for Yacht Blanc and Joan LaBarbera, who are vocal performers. And so their software analyzes their voices in real time and creates these visualizations. So it's kind of a digital synesthesia that occurs. It's a very beautiful performance.
This is done before an audience?
Yes, it's performed for a live audience.
Let's watch a little bit of this.
The system we've designed responds to many different features of the human voice. And so, for example, a lot of the things that we had in our installation in Austria, measuring volume, frequency, statistics of the frequency of the voice, and so on, those are all in place for this concert. But as well, we're computing really accurate measures of pitch. We're computing phoneme, doing phoneme recognition, and sort of larger time scale analysis of human voice. So
I think one of the other things that we're doing that wasn't in our previous projects per se, well, one of them sort of, but is we're going to be using computer vision this time in addition to speech analysis. to really have a good idea about where the performers are on stage. So, for example, there's a spot right here from which the stream of particles seems to be emerging. And it's a point somewhere approximately here on the screen. But in the concert, that would actually track the person's head. And so as they moved around, as they walked around on stage, that point would follow them very, very carefully and closely. So that if they moved around on stage, wherever they were, the things would appear to still come out of their heads.
So human sounds and some custom visualization software, even a little touch of Keith Haring influence I thought I saw there. Let's go right on to the next one with the artist Mariko Mori. And this is not something you could sit in a large theater and watch, like 3 people at a time could go under a dome or something like that?
Yeah, so it's this large futuristic looking pod. It's called Wave UFO, and it's sort of shaped like a UFO. And so 3 people can recline inside this dome at one time, and they're wearing little EEG caps. And so there's software that's monitoring their brain waves and then using the combined signals to create a visualization on the dome inside.
Let's watch.
Mariko's ambitious Wave UFO project is so exciting for I-Beam because we get to take it through starting with the R&D phase, researching experimental optics and computer-human interface, to developing the visual effects footage in the moving image division at I-Beam, all the way through to exhibition and public programs, educational programs.
We will view physical connection from macrocosmos to microcosmos, but then you also realize that in the consciousness there is a world, it's connected. Perhaps we could see as one big energy, including the whole universe.
So a couple of samplings of digital art that was endangered and then recovered at I-Beam after Sandy. Patricia, what was lost?
Well, I think that's one of the things we don't yet know, actually, because we've stabilized the media as much as we can at this point, but until we have the funds to do a detailed recovery with specialists and some of the specialist firms who are in the New York area that take the media apart, clean every bit of it, get rid of all the detritus and the salt and all the other things that came up from the water, we won't really know. We're hoping that we are going to be able to recover a great deal of it, but that's still to be determined. And
is the lesson here to store things in the cloud rather than on physical DVDs on a shelf? I think definitely it's that you have to find new ways of preserving it at all times and in a variety of ways. I think Jonathan might answer that a little bit more detailed than I can.
Yeah, we speak about the cloud, and what that often means is an online service that promises to back up your data and store it forever. That's not a solution I would actually advocate. I think that what's important is to have definitely geographic separation. So having data backed up in 2 places, and certainly also making it available to the public. What we had, we called an archive, but it wasn't really an archive. It was just media stored in a bunch of bins. And a true archive is a set of systems and processes put in place to ensure that the data is migrated regularly and tended to. I mean, you can't even put something on a server or in a dark vault and expect that you're going to be able to read it in 50 years. When we transfer some of this video, for instance, onto hard drives, we're going to use video codecs. But those codecs themselves also change frequently, and so those need to be updated. So really, we want to make this open to the public so that people can access it, and that it becomes part of, I guess, a common resource.
So folks, back up those photos, back up those documents. Just whether or not you're in a digital art gallery. Just take the last minute, Patricia, tell people what they could see if they come as lovers of interesting experimental art to the I-Beam space.
Well, I think it changes all the time depending on who the artists are and what they're working on. But actually at the moment, this Thursday, for the next 2 weeks, we have an exhibition of work by all the artists who have been at I-Beam over the last year, which covers everything from visualizations to computer games to coding work that has been visualized in Arabic to some of Jonathan's work to a great range of activities that should give them a good cross-section of what is happening in this field today.
What's your own work? You've been here as a, earnest representative of saving other people's work. What do you do?
I'm a documentary filmmaker, and so the film I'm working on is looking at digital archives, so I-Beam's story has become part of this film.
Right, I guess as we said at the beginning.
And also, the works that you showed were part of an exhibition called I-Beam Resurfaces. So this week, we put them on display, and we really wanted the public to see what we were able to save and focus on the silver lining of Hurricane Sandy.
Good luck. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And that's our program for this week. We premiere a new show every Wednesday evening at 7:30. Next week, gentrification in Brooklyn, one woman's story on film. And tune into my radio program, 10 a.m. each weekday on WNYC, 93.9 FM and AM 820. Tomorrow, Inside the Gun Industry. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.